Welcome back, everybody. Today we're going to be heading back in time, traveling all the way to ancient Greece
Ooh, very nice.
to explore some ideas from one of the most influential thinkers of all time. And we'll be exploring his ideas on government and power and all that that entails.
Sounds exciting.
It is, and it's amazing to think that these ideas, these concepts that we wrestle with even today, were being debated thousands of years
Oh,
ago.
yeah. Yeah. It really makes you realize that some of these fundamental questions about how we organize ourselves as a society, they've been with us for a very, very long time.
So, who is this mysterious figure we're going to be grappling with today?
Well, none other than Aristotle, one of the giants of Western
Yeah.
philosophy. His work has had a profound impact on everything from science and logic to ethics and, of course, politics, which is what we'll be focusing on today.
Aristotle, huh? I vaguely remember him from my Philosophy 101 class back in college. Something about the Nicomachean ethics rings a bell.
Yes, his famous treatise on virtue and living a good life. But today we're going to be diving into his political philosophy, which is equally rich and insightful.
Okay, so where do we even begin with a thinker as prolific and influential as Aristotle? I mean, his work covers so much ground.
Well, a good starting point is his idea that human beings are by nature political animals. He argued that we're wired for community, that we have this innate drive to come together to form societies to create systems of order.
Political animals, huh?
All right, that's that.
That's an interesting way to put it. It seems like when we hear the word political today, it's often associated with, conflict and division and partisan bickering.
Yeah, I know, it's definitely got a bit of a bad rap these days. But for Aristotle, being political wasn't about ideology or party affiliation. It was about recognizing this fundamental aspect of human nature, this need to live in community and to work together to achieve common goals.
So it was more about cooperation than conflict.
Exactly. He believed that we have this capacity for reason and language and cooperation that sets us apart from other animals and that allows us to create complex societies where we can, strive for a common good.
It's like he's saying that we're not meant to live in isolation, that we thrive when we're part of something larger than ourselves.
Exactly. He saw the state, or the polis as the Greeks called it, as the ultimate expression of this human drive to come together.
So for Aristotle, the state wasn't just about, maintaining order and security. It was about something more.
Oh, absolutely. He saw it as a kind of partnership, a shared endeavor, where individuals come together to create a system of laws and institutions and practices that promote justice and fairness and the opportunity for everyone to live a good life.
Okay, so he had a very idealistic view of the state. But let's face it, throughout history, states haven't always lived up to those ideals. In fact, I'd say more often than not, they've fallen short.
That's true. And Aristotle himself was very aware of this. He wasn't naive about the potential for power to be abused. He spent a lot of time analyzing different forms of government, weighing their strengths and weaknesses, trying to understand what made some systems more prone to corruption than others.
Okay, so he wasn't just an idealist, he was also a pragmatist. He
Yeah.
was looking at the real world and trying to figure out how to make it better.
Exactly. And one of the things that makes Aristotle so fascinating is that he didn't just come up with these abstract theories about government. He actually studied different political systems in great detail. He looked at monarchies, aristocracies, oligarchies, democracies, you name it.
So he was like a political scientist before political science even existed. He was observing these different systems, trying to figure out what worked and what didn't.
Precisely. He was trying to understand the underlying principles that made some systems more stable and just than others.
Okay, well, let's break down some of these different forms of government, just to make sure we're all on the same page. A monarchy, for example, is ruled by a single individual,
Sure.
right? Like a king or a queen.
Exactly. And while a monarchy can be efficient in decision making, having one person in charge can sometimes streamline things, there's always the risk that the monarch could become a tyrant.
Right, power corrupts and all that.
And then there's aristocracy rule by a small group of elite citizens, often based on wealth or noble birth.
Okay, so aristocracy sounds a bit more like a ruling class.
Right, and while an aristocracy can sometimes lead to wise and just rule, there's always the danger that it can devolve into an oligarchy, where a small group of wealthy and powerful individuals rule for their own benefit rather than for the benefit of the entire community.
Oligarchy, yeah, I think we've all seen examples of that throughout history.
Uh-huh.
And then there's democracy ruled by the people.
The citizens have a say in how they're governed.
Which sounds great in theory, but I imagine it has its challenges too.
Oh, definitely. Aristotle recognized the potential pitfalls of democracy as well. He worried that it could easily descend into what he called mob rule, where the passions of the crowd could override reason and lead to impulsive or even unjust decisions.
So it's like he saw the potential for both the best and the worst in each of these systems.
Exactly. He wasn't looking for a perfect system because he knew that no such thing existed. He was more interested in understanding the inherent strengths and weaknesses of each form of government and how to create systems that would mitigate the risks and promote justice and stability.
It sounds like he was a very nuanced thinker, not someone who dealt in absolutes or easy answers.
Exactly. He was a master of analyzing complex issues and teasing out the subtle distinctions between different concepts. He was always looking for that middle ground, that balance between extremes.
That reminds me of something else I vaguely remember from my philosophy class, the golden mean.
Ah, yes. One of Aristotle's most famous ideas. He believed that virtue, in all its forms, lies in finding that sweet spot between two extremes.
Can you give me an example?
Well, take courage, for instance. Aristotle didn't think that true courage was about being reckless or fearless. He saw it as a balance between cowardice, which is a deficiency of courage, and recklessness, which is an excess of courage.
So true courage is about finding that middle ground, knowing when to act bravely and when to exercise caution.
Exactly. And he applied the same principle to his thinking about government. He believed that the best political systems were those that found a balance between different competing interests and values.
So it's like he was looking for a way to create a system that was both stable and just a system that would allow for individual freedom while also promoting the common good.
Exactly. He understood that these two goals aren't necessarily mutually exclusive, that a well-functioning society needs to find a way to balance the needs of the individual with the needs of the community.
So finding that balance, finding that golden mean is key.
Absolutely. And it's a challenge that we still face today as we grapple with questions of individual rights versus the common good freedom versus security and all the other complex issues that confront us in the 21st century.
It's amazing to think that these ideas that Aristotle is wrestling with over 2,000 years ago are still so relevant today.
It really speaks to the enduring power of his work. And it's a reminder that the fundamental questions about how we organize ourselves as a society, how we govern ourselves, how we live together in a way that's both just and fulfilling, these are questions that have been with us for centuries and that will likely continue to challenge us for centuries to come.
So we've got our work cut out for us as we delve deeper into Aristotle's thoughts on government and power.
Oh, we do. And I think we'll find that his insights are as challenging as they are illuminating.
This is going to be fun.
I know, I can't wait. Picking up where we left off, I think it's worth exploring some of the specific forms of government that Aristotle analyzed in more detail.
Yeah, let's dive into that. I'm curious to hear what he had to say about, the pros and cons of each system.
Well, he looked at monarchies, of course, where a single ruler holds supreme power. And he recognized that while this can be efficient, having one person making all the decisions, it also carries a significant risk.
Yeah, I can see how that could be a problem.
Uh-huh.
I mean, absolute power corrupts. Absolutely right.
Exactly. He was very aware of that danger. He pointed out that even the most well-intentioned monarch can be tempted to abuse their power, especially if there are no checks and balances in place.
So he wasn't necessarily opposed to monarchy, but he believed that it needed to be constrained in some way.
Right. He suggested that a council of advisors or a strong legal framework could help to limit the power of the monarch and prevent them from becoming a tyrant.
Interesting. So it's not just about the form of government, but also about the institutions and mechanisms that are in place to ensure accountability.
Precisely. And he applied the same kind of nuanced thinking to his analysis of other forms of government as well.
Like aristocracy, for example.
Right. Aristocracy rule by the best or the most virtuous citizens. It sounds good in theory, but Aristotle recognized that it too had its potential pitfalls.
Yeah, I can see how that could easily devolve into a situation where a small, elite group just rules for its own benefit.
Exactly. He called that an oligarchy, where the wealthy and powerful use their position to enrich themselves at the expense of the rest of society.
So it's like a corrupted form of aristocracy, where the ruling class loses sight of the common good.
Precisely. And Aristotle saw this happen time and time again throughout history.
Well, it certainly seems to be a recurring pattern even today.
Unfortunately, yes. And then, of course, there's democracy, the system that many people hold up as the ideal form of government.
But as we discussed earlier, even Aristotle had some reservations about democracy, right?
Oh, yeah, he definitely did. He was a big believer in the idea that citizens should have a say in how they're governed, but he also worried about what he called mob rule.
The tyranny of the majority.
Exactly. He feared that if the masses were swayed by their passions or by demagogues, they could make impulsive decisions that would ultimately harm the community.
So even democracy needs safeguards to ensure that it doesn't become a tool for oppression.
Absolutely. He believed that a strong constitution, a commitment to the rule of law, and an educated citizenry were all essential for a healthy democracy.
It's like he's saying that democracy is a delicate balance. It requires both freedom and responsibility, both individual rights and a sense of the common good.
Exactly. And finding that balance is an ongoing challenge, something that every society has to grapple with.
So it sounds like Aristotle was a very nuanced thinker when it came to politics. He didn't believe in easy answers or one-size-fits-all solutions.
Absolutely. He was a master of analyzing complex issues and teasing out the subtle distinctions between different concepts. He was always looking for that middle ground, that sweet spot between extremes.
That reminds me of his concept of the golden mean.
Ah, yes, one of his most famous ideas. He believed that virtue in all its forms lies in finding that balance between two vices.
Can you give me an example?
Sure, take courage, for instance. Aristotle believed that true courage wasn't about being reckless or foolhardy. It was about finding that middle ground between cowardice and recklessness.
So it's not about being fearless. It's about being brave in the right way at the right time.
Exactly. And he applied this same principle to his thinking about government. He believed that the best political systems were those that found a way to balance competing interests and values.
So it's like he was looking for a way to create a system that was both stable and dynamic, a system that could adapt to changing circumstances while also upholding core principles of justice and fairness.
Precisely. He understood that a society that's too rigid is just as vulnerable as a society that's too chaotic. It needs to find that sweet spot that allows it to both evolve and endure.
It's fascinating how these ideas that Aristotle was wrestling with over 2,000 years ago are still so relevant today.
I know, it's amazing. It's like he was tapping into something fundamental about human nature and the challenges of living together in community.
So we've talked a lot about different forms of government, but I'm also curious to hear what Aristotle had to say about revolution. I mean, he lived in a time when revolutions were fairly common, right?
They were, and he actually devoted quite a bit of attention to studying the causes of revolutions. He wanted to understand what made societies so unstable, what factors led people to rise up and overthrow their governments.
Well, it's certainly a topic that's still relevant today. I mean, we see revolutions and uprisings happening all over the world.
Exactly. And I think Aristotle's insights can help us to understand these events in a deeper way.
So what did he have to say about the cause of the revolutions?
Well, he identified a number of factors that he believed could contribute to social unrest and ultimately to revolution. One of the most important was inequality.
The gap between the rich and the poor.
Exactly. He observed that when the gap between the haves and the have-nots becomes too wide, it creates resentment and a sense of injustice among those who feel like they're being left behind.
It's like a pressure cooker building up steam. Eventually, something's got to give.
Right. And he also pointed to the abuse of power by those in authority. He argued that when leaders become corrupt, or when they start to rule for their own benefit rather than for the benefit of the community, it erodes trust and legitimacy.
So it's not just about economic factors, it's also about the moral character of those in power.
Absolutely. He believed that leaders have a responsibility to act justly and to serve the common good. If they fail to do so, they risk losing the support of the people.
That makes sense. And you also talk about the importance of what we might call trigger events, right?
Yes, he did. He observed that revolutions are often sparked by seemingly small incidents that, in a context of simmering tensions and grievances, can act as catalysts for widespread unrest.
Can you give me an example?
Sure. Imagine a society where there's already a lot of anger and frustration about economic inequality or political corruption. Then something happens, maybe a local merchant is unfairly taxed, or a citizen is mistreated by a government official.
And that becomes the straw that breaks the camel's back.
Exactly. The incident itself might not be that significant, but it becomes a symbol of all the underlying grievances that people have been harboring.
It's like a spark that ignites a powder keg.
Precisely. And Aristotle understood the power of these symbolic events. He saw how they could mobilize people who might have otherwise remained passive in their discontent.
So it's not just about objective conditions, it's also about perception and how people interpret events.
Exactly. And he also emphasized that revolutions are rarely sudden explosions. They're usually the culmination of a long process of simmering tensions and eroding trust.
It's like a slow burn that eventually erupts into flames.
Precisely. And he believed that understanding this process was crucial for preventing revolutions, or at least for mitigating their destructive potential.
So it's not just about putting out fires, it's about addressing the underlying conditions that create those fires in the first place.
Exactly. It's about creating a society that's more just and equitable, a society where people feel like they have a stake in the system and where their voices are heard.
Which brings us back to the importance of good governance and the role of leaders in shaping a just and flourishing society.
Right, and that's a topic that Aristotle had a lot to say about as well, especially when it came to the dangers of tyranny.
Oh yes, tyranny, the dark side of power.
Uh,
It's a topic that's both fascinating and terrifying.
I agree. And Aristotle's analysis of tyranny is as insightful as it is chilling. He really understood the psychology of tyrants, how they operate, and the methods they use to maintain their grip on power.
So what did he have to say about tyrants?
Well, he described the typical tyrant as someone who comes to power through force or deception, often by exploiting a crisis or a moment of weakness in the existing political system.
So they seize power rather than being elected or appointed.
Exactly. And once they're in power, they often rely on fear and intimidation to maintain control. They might create a climate of suspicion and paranoia where people are afraid to speak out against them.
It's like they rule through terror.
In a way, they do. They understand that fear is a powerful tool for silencing dissent and keeping people in line.
And they also use propaganda, right? To control the narrative and shape public perception.
Oh, absolutely. They are masters of spin. They'll often portray themselves as saviors, as the only ones who can protect the people from some perceived threat, whether it's a foreign enemy, an economic crisis, or even just a general sense of chaos and disorder.
It's like they create a false sense of security to justify their own authoritarian rule.
Exactly. And they're very good at manipulating people's emotions, playing on their fears and anxieties.
It's a scary thought.
It is. And it's a reminder that we need to be vigilant. We need to be critical of those who seek power, and we need to be wary of those who promise easy solutions to complex problems.
Because those easy solutions often come at a high price.
They do. They often involve sacrificing our freedoms, our rights, and sometimes even our humanity.
So Aristotle's insights into tyranny are not just historical curiosities, they're warnings for us today.
Exactly. They remind us that the potential for tyranny exists in every society, no matter how democratic or enlightened it might seem.
And that we need to be constantly on guard to protect our freedoms and our institutions.
Absolutely. Because, as Aristotle knew all too well, power can be a very seductive and dangerous thing. As we wrap up our deep exploration of Aristotle's thoughts, it really strikes me how much emphasis he placed on this idea of balance.
Yeah, it's almost like it's the cornerstone of his entire philosophy, isn't it? This idea of the golden mean, finding that sweet spot between extremes.
Right. It's not about going all in on one thing or completely abstaining from another. It's about finding that middle ground that allows us to live a life that's both fulfilling and virtuous.
And he applies this not only to individual ethics like, courage or temperance, but also to the way we govern ourselves.
Exactly. He believed that the best political systems were those that found a way to balance competing interests and values to create a society that was both stable and just.
And that balance, that golden mean, is something that every society has to constantly strive for because the world's always changing. New challenges arise, new tensions emerge.
Absolutely. It's not a static thing. It's an ongoing process, a constant negotiation between different forces.
Which brings us back to his idea that humans are political animals. It's like he's saying that we're hardwired for this struggle, this constant effort to find balance in our lives and in our communities.
Yeah, and that we're not meant to live in isolation, that we thrive when we're part of something larger than ourselves, when we're working together to create a system of order and justice.
Which is why he placed so much importance on the role of the state in creating the conditions for human flourishing.
Exactly. He saw the state as this kind of partnership, a shared endeavor, where individuals come together to create a system of laws and institutions and practices that promote the common good.
But as we've seen throughout history, those systems, those institutions, they can be corrupted. They can be used to oppress rather than to liberate.
That's true. And that's why Aristotle was so concerned with understanding the different forms of government, their strengths and weaknesses, and the conditions that lead to their success or failure.
So it's not just about having the right system in place, it's about having the right people in power, the right values guiding our decisions, and the right mechanisms to hold those in power accountable.
Exactly. It's about creating a culture of virtue, a society where people are committed to the common good, where they're willing to put the needs of the community above their own selfish desires.
And that's a challenge that we still face today, isn't it? I mean, we see all around us examples of corruption, of abuse, of power, of people putting their own interests ahead of the common good.
Yeah, it's a constant battle, a constant struggle to maintain that balance between individual freedom and the needs of the community, between the pursuit of happiness and the pursuit of justice.
And it's a struggle that requires vigilance. It requires engagement. It requires all of us to participate in the process of shaping our communities and our world.
Absolutely, because as Aristotle knew all too well, the price of apathy is far greater than the price of engagement.
Well said. Well, I think we've covered a lot of ground today, explored some really deep and thought-provoking ideas about government and power and the challenges of creating a just and flourishing society.
Yeah, it's been quite a journey, and I hope our listeners have found it as engaging and illuminating as we have.
Me too. And before we sign off, I just want to remind everyone to check out the song Oligarchy by Bad Religion. It's a great example of how these ancient ideas about power and corruption are still relevant today.
I agree. It's a powerful song that really captures the essence of what we've been talking about.
So until next time, keep those brain cells firing and stay curious about the world around you.